So, Pras, thank you very much for joining us in this Movers and Shakers interview. This Movers and Shakers interview is a series in which we talk to influencers and industry veterans like you uh, to basically collect your brain, collect your ideas on some of the recent issues and pressing issues in the region that you're operating in. And today I'm glad to talk to you about Southeast Asia. And we would like to understand your perspective on different trends that we as consultants observe. And we would like to have your frank opinion about those issues.
Absolutely no
So,
problem. It's a pleasure
thank
to
you
be here.
very much for your time and glad to have you on this show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Right. So I think first and foremost, I would like to see there is a resurgence, to so to say, about electrification in Southeast Asia. You know, you go to Thailand, you go to Indonesia, you go to Singapore, everyone is talking about uh, electrified mobility, especially battery electric vehicle.
Yeah.
And there is a renewed interest in this. And uh, so basically, I want to catch your ideas on what do you think are the levers for this renewed interest, whether it is really sustainable,
Mhm.
whether regulators will really back it up all the way. What's your take on it?
Okay. Thank you very much. Actually, of course, this is an area that I am kind of working in and day out. And electrification is something that is definitely here to stay. And that itself is a very good direction. So we think that the broad direction towards electrification is fine. The main levers, getting into your question, the main levers that trigger this electrification focus is like the environmental protection or pollution related issues. And COVID has kind of exacerbated or highlighted some of these issues as well. But there's also certain other imperatives depending on the country, like ensuring that the country is not left behind when
Mm,
electrification becomes a kind of primary driver in terms of automotive industry. You have certain countries that have had their economies driven by the automotive sector. So
correct.
if they feel that they are working on maybe older technology, they may feel that they will actually get left out of the boat when it starts moving away. And in
True.
certain other countries, it's about utilization of local raw materials. I think
Uh, right.
you know that issue as well. And recently, of course, it's a bit of the media focus as well. So you do see certain players, especially players like Tesla, etc., that have made electrification kind of the talk of the town. So you do see a lot of spotlight on that. But just as a clarification, I think there are some people, of course, who equate electrification as battery electric vehicles.
Correct.
This itself, as Toyota, at least from our perspective, we always talk about electrification as four technologies that are available. The
Correct.
strong hybrid electric or plug-in hybrid electric or battery electric and fuel cell electric. All of them are
Correct.
electrified technologies, and each of them have their strengths and their challenges. And the market will
True.
eventually kind of drive what will gain scale. So
Market will decide what is right for them.
absolutely, the market will have to decide. So, for example, you do see that a lot of the discussion actually currently occurs without a proper, deep understanding of energy policy. So, if you have a
Correct.
very carbon-centric energy policy, but we're still talking about electrification, I think we need to understand what is a well-to-wheel total electrified impact
True.
by also looking at the energy mix, or
True.
we have to look at the cost of the vehicle. So depending on which customer segment, which is the right costing, which allows them to be able to utilize the vehicle, or of course the infrastructure, you require significant infrastructure, or there's mobility patterns. So for example, long distance or heavy duty, these things require a different form of electrification.
Correct.
So of course, all of the technologies absolutely will be deployed,
Right.
but the mix of the electrified technology will probably vary by country and by time. So
Correct.
what I mean to say is that maybe every 10 years or so, you will start seeing incremental shifts
Mm.
in the
Mm.
overall mix. And
Correct.
this is something that we think we will see, especially if we look at Asian markets. We will start seeing certain electrified technologies pick up first, but then you will see more and more shifts in the electrification as we go towards more 2030, 2040, and then 2050. So,
Yeah.
to your question about regulators, well, I think time will bear witness to whether they are going to actually have the same policy in time, because a lot of that discussion is politically motivated, or
Correct.
other issues as well that come into the factor. So, of course, we do believe that we have to see what is realistic and what can build scale.
Correct.
That's one of our things.
So Toyota has always championed hybrid electric vehicles. So do you think this is the right solution for the region, or do you think, uh, as you said, it's a continuum, of course, but do you think hybrid electric is a better suited for this kind of conditions?
So, well, I think a lot of people, of course, Toyota itself has been working at the forefront of electrification for a very long time. So, from before people were talking about electrification, Toyota has been in the electrification game with all of the electrified technologies, from hybrid. We've been working on the Prius from '97. We've had battery electric vehicles from a very long time. We've had fuel cell electric vehicles. So we've had all the technologies, and Toyota is basically supportive of all of the technologies. But we, as I mentioned earlier, we are aware of the strengths and the challenges of each of these technologies. So depending on the energy mix, the cost, the infrastructure, the subsidy, incentive requirement, usage pattern, it will change. Now, if
Right.
I take the example of some of the countries here within the region, if we look at the consumer kind of purchasing power, or the average cost of the vehicle, or the amount of infrastructure that is available, or the amount of subsidy that is available, and the usage pattern, we think that hybrid is a more realistic technology to gain scale. This doesn't mean
Right.
that the other technologies will not sell.
Right.
And
Right.
actually, all of the technologies will work. But to gain scale, I think hybrid is something that can gain the scale quickly. I mean, we've sold 15 million hybrids.
Right.
So if a lot of people, of course, talk about electrified vehicles, and they talk about certain players, but I think Toyota bears witness to the fact that we've been doing it for a long time, so we know the
Yeah.
technology and we know what works, so we
Correct.
can get that scale.
Right.
But if we're
So
talking
maybe if
about
you look at the total number of miles that are driven on battery, Toyota will far exceed any other player.
oh, absolutely, I
Yeah.
think there's no doubt, even in terms of total CO2 tonnage reduced, the amount of oil imports that we've reduced, there's no doubt. So
Correct.
one of the things that I try to use just as a kind of consideration point is, when we look at electrification, we should look at the CO2 emission of the vehicle, or the well to
Right.
wheel total emission,
Right.
but we also have to look at the kilometers driven.
Correct.
And when you start looking at these kind of factors together, you will realize that it's okay to have some technologies, but they will always be niche technologies. So, for example, maybe for short distance personal mobility, or for luxury segments, of course, we think we'll immediately have a market for some of the technologies. But if you're
Correct.
looking at the mass utilization,
Mm.
we have around a significant number of vehicles that are sold globally. If we start looking at mass utilization, we do think hybrid has its benefit. But again, when it starts coming to fleet, when it starts coming to shared mobility, when it starts coming to luxury mobility, you will start seeing BEVs and FCVs pick up a lot more. So I think that's our current thinking.
Fantastic. So we also know that you are working on fuel cell electric vehicles. So when do we see those in Southeast Asia? Do you think the market is ready for that?
So there's no doubt that fuel cell is actually, as a technology, at least hydrogen in an overall scale is a very good technology, not just because of mobility, but because of the fact that hydrogen is, we call it like the Swiss knife of energies, right? You can use it for production. You can actually decarbonize kind of certain fuel by
Hmm.
using CCS, or you can, of course, start storing the energy. You can transport the energy. So you can move from countries that are more renewable energy heavy. You can start moving energy to countries that are more fossil fuel dependent.
Right.
And of course, you can use it for industrial kind of byproduct, for industrial kind of usage, or for mobility, or for heating. So there's multiple usage for hydrogen. Now,
Correct.
when it comes to mobility per se, we think that it's very good, especially for certain segments, whether it's fleet, or whether it's
Hmm.
for heavy duty, or whether
Hmm.
it's for long distance.
Right.
So for these kind of areas, we think hydrogen will pick up. But here we still need the technology. We need all of the players. Hydrogen doesn't work with just Toyota bringing in a Mirai and saying,
Correct.
let's put in the Mirai and then it'll work. We need
Correct.
all of the factors. You need the scale. So
Correct.
from that perspective, I think it's a suitable technology for many countries here, especially
Correct.
looking at the energy mix. But it may take a bit of time to really
Right.
scale up. But I
Right.
think we will see pilots and demonstrations that do
Hmm.
take place pretty quickly. So I do believe that countries like India or Indonesia or Thailand, no
Hmm.
doubt we will start seeing pilots demonstrations in the next few years. And
Fantastic.
then I think that that will bear witness to a growth by usage pattern.
Yeah,
I
that's right.
think that that's what we see. But actually, let me also maybe flip the discussion and let me ask you a couple of questions if you
Sure,
don't mind.
sure. Of
So,
course.
uh, you know, you guys, as Frost and Sullivan, you have a significant amount of expertise in electrification. You've also
That's
borne
right.
witness to a lot of the discussions that different OEMs have, or governments have, or other, NGOs have.
Right.
In that context, one of the factors that we always talk about is usage. Different
Right.
electrified technologies have different usage. What is your thinking about electrification and usage patterns rather than it's a single solution that fits all? So, just to get your take on that.
Sure. So at Frost, we don't believe that there is one size that will fit all, and we echo your view that all the technologies will coexist, and technologies will find their usage or find their best use case.
Right,
So when we do the projections, we call it XEV. So just to avoid the confusion, we said all types of EV, and the hybrid electric vehicle actually falls into the electric vehicle. We call it XEV, just to
yeah,
clarify. The only reason why the battery electric vehicle seems to be top of the mind is because it's a uh, that is something that is in the vogue, number one. Number two, uh, there is also a lot of investment that is happening in battery and the charging infrastructure, and the charging methods of charging, which is battery swapping or
yes,
fast charge or slow charge. So there is a lot of action in that particular context,
mhm,
and that's the reason why probably battery electric vehicle gets a better um, mind share than the hybrid electric vehicle. But by no means we ignore hybrid electric vehicles,
right.
and we do include that in most of our projections, and we call it XEV, and that we think is definitely a solution which is scalable, which is relatively cheaper, which does not require a separate infrastructure, and therefore has its own merits.
Okay. What about between like we have certain ways of thinking. Toyota is really a global player. So we have North America market, Europe market, China market, Japan market, Asia market. And we do think that the market will eventually determine which share of electrification, depending on the time frame, which will kind of gain scale. What do you see as the biggest differences for Asia, or what are Asia unique factors that will drive the electrification from Frost and Sullivan's perspective?
So what we find is the electrification, and which is when I say electrification, I'm maybe focusing a bit more on battery electric vehicle, is driven by the share of renewable energy. So most of the European countries find that, first of all, European countries have really focused on reducing the carbon footprint of the country, of the company, of transportation, different sectors. So, trying to reduce the carbon footprint seems to be the vision for everything that they do. And that's where probably increasing the share of renewable energy
Mhm.
coupled with battery electric vehicles seems to be the driving force behind Scandinavian countries, behind some other countries in Europe where electric vehicle take-up rate is higher.
Right.
Whereas in Asia, I think we don't find any such over compassing, over arcing objective that is driving either hybrid electric vehicles or battery electric vehicles. I think when it comes to changing habits of the customers or pushing them from something that they're most comfortable with something that is new, the regulators have to play their role.
Yes.
And what we find is the regulators haven't really found their business case or a compelling reason to push them into a certain direction, and it is more of trying to fit into the global trend or trying to make sure that you manufacture something that can be exported. Those seems to be the reason, and that's why sometimes that's why I asked you this question: with will regulators back it up all the way? That's where we feel that if they find that the uptake rate is not very high, then they may may have maybe in two minds whether to push it or not. So in Asia, it is likely to be driven mainly by the customer habits, mainly by uh, indirect benefit like incentives or duty incentives rather than directly putting money into the customer's hands. So that's why both these things are likely to evolve quite differently from each other.
Yeah. No, I think that's an interesting point that you make, especially about what is the objective of
Objective,
electrification.
yeah,
So, if the objective is clear, I don't think that, at least, fundamentally, I think the market will drive the technology.
correct,
The objective should be driven by the government. So,
correct,
if the objective is very clear, let's get to start, reducing the total carbon emissions, or let's try to drive scale in the total industry. I think then different players, as long as you're kind of incentivizing equally, I think technologies will start making advancement
exactly,
itself.
exactly,
That's
exactly.
what we have noticed. And at least this is one of the areas that we are continuously engaging with governments as well,
Yep,
that we will try to bring in all of the technologies, but the key is
correct,
how do we build scale
exactly,
that can get the maximum benefit for the country and for the
exactly,
people.
exactly.
Yeah.
So moving on to other trend that I find particularly interesting in this
Yeah.
region. So for years we have been tracking the Southeast Asia market, and this is a very peculiar market because if you compare it to uh, countries of similar GDP, similar macro economic profile, the penetration of smartphones, penetration of data, consumption of data
Mhm.
is extremely high in these countries,
Yeah.
right? It's not a difficult sight to see if you are walking on the streets of Bangkok. It's not difficult to see that the street vendors are also sitting with their iPad and watching videos on
Yeah.
completely on data.
Yeah.
Or at one point in time, BlackBerry Messenger, the biggest users were Indonesian customers.
Okay.
Despite that, despite such a high digitization in smartphone, we find that the connected cars are
Mhm.
not really that prevalent. So, what do you think is the issue? Is it the challenge? It's definitely not infrastructure. Is it
Right.
regulation? Is it services not offered? Is it that the OEMs haven't really taken the interest, or is it price point? What do you think is the issue? Why we don't see high penetration of connected cars?
So maybe my view is slightly different, insofar as I think that it depends on the definition of connected vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
So if you talk about the exponential growth of rideshare,
Mm-hmm.
ride-hailing services, your Grabs or your Gojeks, in some ways these are a connected mobility
Yeah,
solution.
that's right.
So uh, I do believe we have seen that growth, and that has actually driven a completely different way of movement for a lot of people.
Right.
So from that perspective, we do have connected vehicles. But if you talk about private users,
Yes.
and we're starting to talk about like true remote features like a smart key box or find my car or vehicle health monitoring or pay how you drive, we think these are some things that are slowly coming into commercial use. So it's not that it doesn't exist, it's coming in, but it's kind of a step by step approach. And
Right.
the reasons why we do believe that the speed in which this has been deployed is not as much is there are maybe multiple factors, but off the top of my head, what I can think of is one is, of course, as you said, the regulatory issue. Some of the personal data or cross border data transfer, these kind of things need to be a bit clearer for
Right.
companies to strongly push this approach. But also, if you look at it from the consumer perspective, I think a lot of consumers don't want to be tracked. They are bothered a
Uh,
bit about data privacy. But
right.
then, of course, the big issue is no one is really willing to pay
Uh,
for a lot of these services. So they're
correct.
fine saying, I don't mind getting the infotainment treatment or that kind of area as long as it's free. But the moment you start talking about okay, it's going to cost some money, then usually there is a bit of a resistance. But
Correct.
I think that if they start getting the real benefit, just to give you an example, if we can start saying that your maintenance can become more optimized, that means you may not
Right.
have to go for the same typical periodical maintenance
Right.
approach.
Right.
You can go when your vehicle really requires it, depending on the health of your
Right.
vehicle, or depending on your
Right.
insurance premium can come down if
Right.
you're a very good driver. Naturally, then you will see more people who
Correct.
may be willing to do that. But it takes a bit of time for
Correct.
them to see that actual quantifiable benefit. But
Correct.
where I do see this will grow is really in fleet.
Uh-huh.
So, for example, fleet may be really one of the critical triggers when it comes to the fleet management system or the driver behavior. For example, rash driving or harsh acceleration, harsh braking. These kind of things become like direct costs on the P&L of fleet companies.
Correct.
From that perspective, I do think you will see a lot of connected services coming
Right.
from fleet.
Correct.
And you will start seeing other areas maybe more step by step. I think like connected loans. A good example is connected loans. Maybe many people at the moment in Asia find it difficult to sometimes even get a loan because
Right.
of certain reasons. But if they have connected services, maybe getting your loan threshold may be easier.
Oh, is it? Can you explain this a little bit?
So this is just to kind of say that if your vehicle is being tracked,
Ah,
so naturally, if I'm a bank, I may be
right.
more willing to lend you money if I know that I can get
Okay.
the asset back and there's no
Right.
default,
Right. Right.
or where someone actually takes away the vehicle and I don't find it ever again. So
Understand.
from that perspective, I think banks and financial institutions will start being a little more kind of focused on these areas. So we will see
That's
connected services, but in these areas.
right. So I think what I hear you saying is uh, customers are ready for it, but they need to find a very compelling value proposition, or preferably cost saving. When I say value proposition, cost saving, or some kind of convenience, or some kind of getting the service that they are not able to get. If they're able to do that, then they would be able to
Exactly.
go for the
At the
services.
end of the day, for car companies right now, of course, it's a differentiator. So you
Right.
do see it. I mean, I'm not just talking about in Asia, I'm even talking about global car makers that exist, whether in Europe or US. They all find it a difficult value proposition from their own business case. They do believe they
Hmm.
need to use it initially as a differentiator.
Hmm.
But then eventually, when you have the data and you start gathering the data, or you have to try to then start monetizing, and because it's a huge investment.
Correct.
So in that context, I think a lot of car companies are probably struggling with this.
Hmm.
So in some ways, I do believe that there is some kind of a latent demand for it, but
Hmm.
it may take a bit of time
Correct.
for it to really build up and start becoming a business where it becomes like a mutual benefit for the customer, and then of course for the companies to keep offering it.
Correct. So you do believe there is a latent demand. I think you have answered my next question. So
Okay.
which services do you think will drive this adoption? Because sometimes what happens is, uh, uh, you don't have. There can be 100 things that can be done by connected, but if you offer that one thing that drives the adoption,
Yeah.
then suddenly they start seeing value in other 99 services that you
Right.
might offer. So do you have some sense on what are those one or two services that will really drive the adoption?
As I said previously, I think we'll probably start seeing it more from the financial side.
Mm.
So whether it's on getting loans or on insurance, uh,
Right.
you may see people who are more and more driven to try and get a connected service so their insurance premium can be more optimized.
Correct.
But naturally, this also has, if people are not good drivers, you have certain issues where maybe their premiums go up.
Correct.
So there will be some kind of learning curve in terms
I
of
know.
all of this area.
Yes.
But naturally, the eventual direction is good because it will make people even more careful drivers.
Correct.
It improves the safety on the road.
Exactly.
These kind of things can genuinely help. So I do believe
Correct.
we will see that. And typically, maybe the most common or baseline mapping services or infotainment services, I think these will come in, but I think this will be expected to be part of your basic package.
Right.
rather than as an additional service that people are willing to kind of take up.
Fantastic. So before I move on to next, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, actually, I believe that, for example, if we look at the life cycle of connected services,
Okay.
where do you see, at least from Frost and Sullivan's analysis, which
Hmm.
area do you see as being kind of maybe the biggest focus area where not only OEMs, but maybe third parties are starting to see some, interest in or starting to come in, whether globally or in Asia? Do you have any areas that you can think of?
So what we believe is, this infotainment and connecting your smartphone to car and being able to browse, etc. Maybe the initial attractions as far as connected services are concerned. But as you mentioned, the real value for OEMs from connected services will come when they actually start seeing the customer throughout the life cycle. I think uh, by now both of us know that it's very hard for OEMs to track the customer after the warranty period is over.
Right.
Then you extend the warranty to 3 years, you'll see the customer for 3 years.
Yeah.
You extended warranty for 5 years, you'll see for, but sixth year onwards, you can't see the customer. It's very
Yes.
difficult to
Yes.
track and get the customer, win the customer back into your fold.
Right.
And that's where I think connected vehicles can make a big difference. Like you rightly mentioned, if the maintenance can be uh, streamlined, or if the at least you may not be able to control which air filter it puts or which oil he puts, but even if you are able to control when there is a major engine work,
Yeah.
whether major transmission work, that's probably your link to the customer
All right.
throughout the life cycle. And that is probably where customers may not see the value right now, because maybe they are used to going to their neighborhood mechanics, etc. But over a period of time, if the OEMs are able to show value to the customer throughout the life cycle, I think that would be a fantastic win-win proposition for both OEMs as well as the customers. Of course, third-party connected service players are uh, definitely looking at it, and they will look at point of interest services. They will look at
Right.
offering some kind of value adds, but the kind of connection OEM should have with their customers, we think that connected services or the connection between the car and some kind of a central server with OEM is probably the best way to look at it.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. Maybe if I may ask another question
Mhm.
related to connected, is there some other industry where you feel, for example, airline or hotel or other areas that you feel have been able to really appropriately deliver connected services that have strengthened their own core business, which also may be an interesting parallel for even OEMs to think about?
I think if OEMs have to think about, they should look at smartphones. I think smartphones is the best. Like Apple exactly knows what I do with my phone. They know whether it is in warranty. I don't have to carry anything.
Yeah.
They know exactly what I've downloaded, what I do. So I think there is a lot to learn from when it comes to connected services. Of course, smartphones are the holy grail.
Right.
There is a lot to learn from them. But especially if you are talking about airlines and hotel companies, I think, and I think I've discussed with some of your team members that if an airline can have a loyalty program, if a hotel can have a loyalty program, why can't Toyota have a loyalty program, which
Right.
actually gets the customer back into your fold uh, several years? You are able to retain the customer. Why don't you have a platinum graded Toyota customer who always comes back to you?
Yes.
So I think that is where uh, probably the business model needs to evolve. I think the
Yeah.
connection between the customer and say a brand like Toyota is now relegated to the uh, components that they use from you, and probably that is how it was envisioned, that if they are using a Toyota car, they will have to use Toyota components. But with
Right.
the entry of third party, that connection is sort of broken,
Yeah.
and you may have to probably evolve a little bit more to get the customer back into your phone.
Right.
So I think let's move to the next trend, and which you mentioned, rightly mentioned, which is again very important trend in this region, which is shared
Yeah.
mobility. We have two big unicorns which are born out of this region, Grab
True.
and Gojek,
Yeah.
who are born out of this. So, as a market leader, how do you see this mobility solution providers or these e-hailing operator? Do you see them as, on one hand, they are your customers, on the other hand, they are also your competitors, on
Yeah.
the other hand, they are just a value chain player? So, how do you see them and how do you place them in the entire value chain, or from your point of view?
Right. So, of course, when you start talking about like shared mobility and these mobility players, shared mobility in itself is not new. It's something that's existed for a long time. Public transportation is shared, or
Correct.
paratransit, essentially in all of our Asian countries. We've had some form of paratransit that's shared. I think
Correct.
it's just the evolution is more with smart technology,
Correct.
and then how to integrate a bit more beyond just the mobility element as well, payment or other services. So from that perspective, we don't think of these players, whether they come in, whether it's Grab or Gojek or any of these players, as a threat. I mean, honestly, we do believe that these are all fundamentally, for us at least, as far as we're concerned, this is something that is here to stay. So we have to see how to make it an opportunity and how to work closely with them. So from that perspective, we do believe that the critical element is how do we work effectively with them, and where required, how do we try to learn from them and actually provide our own services, because
Right.
it's kind of also required for us to start thinking about how we can improve
Correct.
our own services based on their requirements. So for
Correct.
example, can we do faster maintenance services
Right.
for fleet customers so that we are able to also start competing with them and we are able to provide a good service for them? So I think these kind of areas we will see. But even as far as Toyota is concerned, naturally, uh, when it comes to shared mobility or when it comes to this kind of different mobility services, we ourselves also have to start thinking about where we want to participate,
Right.
where we want to learn, where we want to cooperate, where we have to collaborate.
Right.
So certain areas, definitely we will have advantages that they don't have. Certain
Right.
areas, they will have advantages that we don't have. So
Right.
critical element is to find that right balance between competition and collaboration
Right.
with these
So
players.
we call
And as
it
you know,
competition.
exactly. I mean, as you know, we've already invested in some of them, so
Exactly.
it's not something that we are completely new to.
Correct.
We do know them, but in certain areas, of course, we have to compete. In certain areas, we have to collaborate.
Fantastic. So you definitely don't see them as a threat. So it is more of an opportunity. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. I think if we start thinking of it as a threat, I think that's kind of signifies a bigger problem with us internally. So whenever you have an inevitable trend, we have to accept that inevitable trend and make it into our opportunity. I think that's kind of one of the critical requirements for any kind of multinational. I think we have history is paved with many companies that kind of refuse to try and take everything as an opportunity. So
Correct.
Toyota, I think, strongly believes that we, even our president Akio Toyoda, has been strongly saying. I think you've probably heard. He said we're no more an automotive company; we're a mobility company.
Mobility company.
And recently, he's also been saying, actually, we believe in software first, which is a big statement to come
Big
from a
statement.
company that is known for good product, and saying,
Correct.
actually, we are a software company as well. So
Right.
this is a big. It's, of course, it's a mind shift change for a lot of people within the company, but it's
Correct.
something that we embrace and we're kind of really trying to work on.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the right way of looking at it. As I mentioned, there is no single solution that is going to dominate mobility. Automotive as an industry did not change for 100 years, but suddenly now the doors are open and the automotive has to transform itself into mobility. And
Right.
that's where different solutions are going to coexist.
Yeah.
And they may be opposing each other and in many cases overlapping each other. Yeah. So I
I think
completely agree with
the
your opinion.
fundamental issue is, one of the points that usually I always try to think of is, why does the person want to move, right? So if we start thinking about that, for example, if I'm taking my children to school, I may require a certain mobility means. Or if I'm taking
Right.
my mother to the hospital, I may require a different mobility mean. Or if I'm alone and I'm going out with my friends for a drink, maybe I have a different mobility mean. So the critical element is, the objective of the mobility is
Right.
something that we should also understand rather than
Exactly.
think only about just the means of mobility. So
Correct.
that is the area that I think smart technology and data is now making us more refined to start
Right.
thinking about this in a better way.
Right.
But the biggest issue I always see, especially when it comes to shared mobility, is still the business case because they have to
Mm.
scale up and they have to succeed. So maybe if I may ask you a question,
Okay.
especially for shared mobility players, we always see kind of the capital injection driven growth of this industry.
Mm. Mm.
So, where are you seeing maybe actual sustainable growth in some of these shared mobility players, especially for people who want scale? I think if you're small size and you're just in a town, maybe you can become successful and become the monopoly in that town. But if you really want global growth or regional growth, a lot of times they're just capital driven. So, how do you see that?
So I think here we'll have to divide the entire markets into different segments. And if I have to focus on what is happening in around us in Southeast Asia, uh, what has happened is when someone like Grab or Gojek came, they actually started competing with existing taxi segment. So there was no absence of uh, this kind of shared mobility. Like you said, it always exists. Of
Right.
course, these two are slightly different flavors. They are not identical in terms of solutions, but they uh, satisfy the same need. That
Yes.
is a driven vehicle, which provides a point-to-point
Yeah.
service at a fees that is additional or over and above what you would pay for a public transport. So some contours of it or some aspects of it are very similar.
Right.
So what has happened is in Southeast Asia, uh, the e-hailing players, when they came into existence, because of the strong existence of taxi services, their business case, it took a while for people to accept it. Whereas if you go to a market like US, where taxis were really plying into the city center, and when you went to suburban areas, there was almost no form of
Yes.
public transport. It was very easy for customers to embrace this kind of a solution, and
Yeah.
that's where probably they saw an exponential growth. Whereas in markets like Southeast Asia, markets like India also was a different case because you had auto rickshaws. You didn't really
Yeah.
have a uh, car which went around as a taxi. So in very few cities we had. So even in India, it probably did very well. So uh, in this region, both these unicorns are forced to innovate, and that's what they have done. I think uh, that's where I find the degree of innovation that we see in these two companies exceeds all other e-hailing players. They
True.
have they have not just stuck themselves into cars, but they have gone from bicycles to buses,
Yes.
everything,
Yes.
right? Then they have gone into delivering from food to massage, everything,
Yes.
medicines, grocery, everything, right?
Yeah.
In fact, Indonesia had fantastic services. Suppose I forget my wallet at my home,
Yeah.
and what do I do? I just call Gojek and they will deliver it to me in like less than $1. I don't have to even go anything.
Yeah.
So these kind of services is very innovative. But when it comes to meeting profitability, I think probably what financial services that get offered along with uh, the sharing services is probably the way for for companies like this to grow. Scale, of course, is one of the important areas, but I think it's a very unusual expansion from going from shared services to getting into wallet services and
Yeah.
trying to get into. So that's a superb innovation. So I would say these companies are born out of innovation, and they would need to rather than just looking at it as a single direction that I have to scale up, scale up, scale up to become profitable.
Yeah.
I think they need to look at what are the other opportunities which are non-linear opportunities, which are not obvious out of the box
Yeah.
opportunities to look at how they can make profit and become more sustainable. So I would not be surprised if there are more such innovations in offering
Mhm.
that would come from these companies.
I mean, I find it also one thing that I found really interesting is especially with COVID, which normally impacted their business a lot. I mean, the food delivery growth that they are
Yes,
able to kind of capture is amazing. That is
phenomenal.
something that they are now almost like premier food
Yes.
delivery company. So I agree with you that definitely their innovation, their ability to not rely on anything in the
Correct.
past and always
Correct.
think about something new and willing to try, and if it fails they can quickly shift,
Right.
which is something that they are able to do.
Yep. Being nimble footed, being
Very, yeah.
innovative, out of the box, trying to change themselves into addressing completely different needs which are not initially envisioned. I
Yeah.
think those are the characteristics this company displayed. And that takes me to the next point,
Okay.
which is startups. So
Start.
these are, of course, these promising startups. We had unicorns. They are now no
Yeah.
more, although they are startups by their DNA, but they're unicorns. They're big companies.
Yes.
But my question to you is, do you see some interesting startups in Southeast Asia which are bringing in um, newer innovation, newer business models, or anything like this? I think I know that you are quite active in that space,
Yeah.
so I'm sure you have looked at a lot of such startups. So maybe if you can give an example, nothing like it, but if you can
Sure.
give some hot areas or hotspots where such a innovation is needed, that would be wonderful.
Sure. I'm happy to talk about it. I think I believe that, as they say, necessity is the mother of all invention, right? So, uh, whether luckily or unluckily, we have a lot of necessity. So, whether it's a necessity for still public transport is not yet fully
Correct.
available, or certain areas, there's still a lot of potential for new kind of requirements that are coming in, whether it's water delivery, food delivery, many things that are possible. So you do see a lot of innovation that is coming up wherever there is a necessity. We do see this coming up. Now, if I'm talking about my personal experience, so uh, in addition to my role within Toyota, kind of as a regional office, I'm also responsible for something called Toyota Mobility Foundation.
Correct.
And what Toyota Mobility Foundation does is we try to solve social problems through mobility
Hmm.
innovation.
Okay.
So what we do is we kind of take a significant mobility related problem, and then we try to partner with anybody who can come and help solve that issue. And what we've
Okay.
taken on is we've taken on issues like congestion or last mile mobility, these kind of issues. And let me give you an example of India.
Okay.
So actually in India, we were very pleased, and Toyota strongly believes that, of course, the backbone of mobility, especially in cities, has to be public transportation, and other forms of mobility have to work around that as well. And we do know that the Indian government started taking on an ambitious project of introducing a lot of metro services.
Correct.
And these metro services, of course, they're huge investments, but they are very effective considering the number of people and making sure that it's the most effective kind of service. But by virtue of the fact that it's a metro, the route is completely fixed. So you have the starting point and the ending point. So naturally, what this does require is first mile, last mile solutions to the metro.
Exactly.
So what we started a program called STAMP with a organization called World Resources Institute in India. World Resources Institute is global, but the India office, which is a very capable office as well. And the STAMP basically stands for Station Access and Mobility Program. So
Okay.
how do we try to start looking at innovation for first mile and last mile? And when we started that particular activity, our approach was we try to understand the exact requirements. We try to get some data, so it's like a data-driven approach. And then we would start calling innovators from around the city that we select and ask them to solve a particular problem. So we started in
Okay.
Bangalore,
Okay.
and we asked for first and last mile solutions for Bangalore, and we got very good kind of response. And we did see a lot of companies. Finally we selected three one which was a very innovative bike sharing or kind of a bike scooter sharing service, which can be
Okay.
a pick up and pick off and drop off anywhere service, which ended up becoming very successful. But we selected them and we helped give them a platform to expand. We also picked up a parking solution, which is kind of utilizing empty space and starting to
Okay.
make it into a parking solution. Or third one is we also looked at some kind of a carpooling solution, especially for commutes, these kind of areas.
Okay.
And we supported this activity, and of course, the innovation that we saw in this program was spectacular, actually. And young people, people who may not have a lot of experience, but they have the passion, they have the idea. So, with a bit of molding and with a bit of kind of direction, uh, they can come up with, as we were talking about, very nimble, very agile, very interesting solutions, and they can immediately adapt to the customer needs as well. So we started
Very
off
interesting.
actually in Bangalore. And then
Okay.
we took the same program and we looked at first mile, last mile a bit more holistically. So we said, first mile, last mile, initially we were looking at the hardware, like what, okay, is it a bike sharing or a car sharing or a parking? Then we started saying, actually, to understand, first we need information, right?
Hmm.
What
Hmm.
solution is available? Then we need to have the solution. Then we need maybe the infrastructure. Should there be parking? Should there be charging infrastructure? Then we start looking at the station itself, how to make the
Right.
station as easily accessible as possible.
Correct.
Then we
Correct.
start looking at payment. So eventually now we are trying to expand this program to 7 cities in India.
Hmm.
And in
Oh,
each city, we are looking at a different type of innovation. It
wow.
looks at a different element of the first mile, last mile journey. So this is what we're doing. And as I said, I think we've seen fantastic innovation. And we're doing the similar programs in Kuala Lumpur right now. We're doing
Okay.
another program in Thailand, in Bangkok. So, of course, all are slightly different in terms of their context and the problem that we're solving, but all with innovation and very exciting. It kind of gives us also energy when we do our job.
So I think this is a hot and burning issue, first and last mile connectivity. Is there any other issue where you see any unmet needs or any hotspot where you would uh, look for innovative companies to work with you, or Frost
So,
and Sullivan to recommend you some companies to work with?
so actually, the area that I personally, again, with Toyota Mobility Foundation, we are now trying to drive a lot. This is not something that's commercially something that may have a lot of immediate potential, but we do believe that if we are starting to look at a problem like congestion,
Hmm.
uh, these initially we were looking at congestion, and a lot of the discussion is about traffic flow, traffic management, these kind of areas. But essentially, all of congestion related planning is a integration of city planning.
Correct.
So, but a lot of city planning was based on maybe historical either kind of actions or traditional learning from other cities. But now we have data, and data is, as they say, the oil of the new oil that we actually need to consider. And data can completely revolutionize or change the way we think of city planning. So, for
Correct.
example, if we're looking at mobility planning itself, of course, ride hailing players are already looking at some of these areas. But with data, we can start looking at, for example, incident management, predictive analysis. We can start looking at, all of these areas. So the one area that I am very interested in, and we're doing a project actually, I refer to it in Thailand as well as in Malaysia. We are trying to use data to improve traffic management and city planning.
Okay.
And we are trying to gather different companies, again, not only from Asia, even from around the world, to try and see how we can start refining the data. We're in kind of early stages. There's a lot of data, there's a lot of ideas. Still, we need to kind of think about how to refine it, how to create these algorithms, how to make it most effective. But it's starting to come. So we are looking, I think you've heard of a lot of city OS concepts or
Correct.
this kind of DX way of thinking. So these are the areas that I am very interested and excited. Whenever I hear about anyone using data for city planning, I always want to have a conversation with them.
Fantastic. So I think since in Southeast Asia most of our cities are congested, Maybe that is the unique business model, or that would be our gift to the world.
That would be, yeah. If we were able to solve that, I think it's a fantastic, it's the perfect living lab for us to be able to trial a lot of these areas. So the wonderful thing about data is also, if we really look at traffic flow, traffic management, there's a lot of ideas that are very hyper local, right? So utilizing the data appropriately is able, allows us to not just try to come and pick up like a cookie cutter solution that worked in London. Transport for London used this solution, so let's try the same solution.
Doesn't
It
work.
never works,
Never
never
work.
works. Just to give you an example, again, I don't want to mention which city. We did something on traffic light management in one of our Asian countries. But when you start looking at traffic light management, typically we can say, okay, let's try to do it scientifically based on vehicle data, and we can try to do this. But we understand that, for example, the behavior of the traffic police has to change, meaning they still want to control how to change the button. Or when you have a politician that is driving on the road, they don't want to leave it up to the normal 2-minute traffic, 3-minute traffic light. They want to change the button immediately.
Correct.
So you have to understand these contexts. But with data, you can first come up with the hypothesis and then you put in the local context. So I think that's an interesting area that we are learning.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So we also have a lot of interest in startups. So if you have any questions, I'll answer.
Sure. I think the biggest issue maybe that I see is, you spoke about the culture. I think the critical element is, especially if you start talking to OEMs who have traditionally become big on a certain business model, and then of course every OEM starts talking about how they want to work with startups and how they want to kind of integrate, but always it's the culture, how to integrate the culture between startups and OEM. So what advice would you have to a company like Toyota to try and work with the culture of a startup, and how do we make sure that uh, you know the OEM culture doesn't start crushing the startup culture, but at the same time the startup doesn't end up kind of being so risky that it potentially just burns. We have every maybe 100 startups, only one may become really the unicorn that you were talking about, maybe more than 100. So if you could give me some advice, that would be great.
Right. So the first advice would be hire us. But jokes apart, I think what we have seen successful companies do is to create some kind of, I mean, if I have to give a biological example, create some kind of antibody within yourself. So there should be a separate team which is not afraid of questioning the very foundation of where your business is built on. Something that is not uh, afraid to self destroy some of the successes that we have tasted. So I think that's the only way, because if uh, what tends to happen is, and especially I've been a Toyota alumni myself, uh, and it's not just limited to Toyota. Most of the successful companies get trapped into what we call a success trap. You
Mhm.
you are successful doing something, and therefore you can't think of doing it in any other way, and that becomes your success
Right.
trap. So you need something in your own organization which will actually break your success trap and force you to think differently.
Yeah.
uh, there is no right solution for it, or there is no, I would say, exact recipe for it. This is something that needs to balanced out, because like you rightly said, if the startups become too much, then they will land up draining too much resources, and if they are not successful, then they don't really add any value back to the parent organization, and if the parent organization is very successful, they'll end up crushing the startup guys.
Right.
So the balance is definitely required. But what I've seen some of the other companies have done is uh, they have floated sister companies. So it's a different company, different culture. So although the it's a 100% owned subsidiary, it runs completely independently. There
Right.
are some companies who have tried to put all these so-called startup companies or startup ideas into a different location, or the office look and feel is completely different. So if you look at them in the same factory environment, they tend to think in the same way,
Yeah.
so they should not be constrained by your problems. They should
Right.
they should be able to think freely. So this is something that these companies have done. uh, they have hired people differently. They have gone to places where they otherwise usually would not go. If you hire your talent from top 5 business schools, maybe you need to completely change your hiring strategy and go to institutes that you have never seen
Yeah.
from your own parent organization. So there are various strategies that are used, but ultimately this is uh, based on something that if you don't question yourself, or if you don't kind of challenge your own success, then your competitor or somebody else is going to challenge your success
Right.
at some point in time. So you need to have some kind of mechanism that you are able to do it yourself. There is no exact recipe for it, but this is the way forward as far as this particular challenge is concerned.
I think our president, at least for us, we get a lot of that from our president, Akio Toyoda. He tries to challenge us to change more than even the external factors. So I think that
Right.
is good. We ourselves have to learn. And as you say, I think we should make sure that we don't get caught up in kind of the success trap, but at the same time, don't end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So it's
Correct.
the right balance between the two.
Correct.
But
That's right.
really, thank you very much.
Thank you. Pras, it was wonderful talking to you. It's almost 1 hour, and we are talking way back in the evening. Both of us are talking after office hours, but I think I didn't realize that 1 hour flew. It was wonderful talking to you. Thanks a lot for spending time with us, and your insights were very useful. So we'll publish these insights on our website, frost.com. It would be available to you as well as to our subscribers. And thank you very much for sharing your insights so freely. Thank you
No,
so much.
absolutely, no problem. And I look forward to continuing kind of collaborating with you going forward. Thanks, Vivek.
Yep.
Appreciate
Yep.
it.